would be remiss if I did not take the opportunity to correct one omission in last week's show. 1973 marked the introduction of the Xerox Alto, a computer built by the people at Xerox PARC. An expensive one, absolutely, but a decade ahead of its time. It had a monitor, it had a mouse-driven user interface, and an operating system with a true desktop metaphor. And it wasn't a mainframe-attached device. It wasn't a terminal. It was its own machine. An imperfect one, certainly, but compared to anything else that existed on the market then, the Alto was a marvel, and it was sadly not fully embraced by Xerox. Had it been, history would have branched off differently, in a world where maybe Microsoft and Apple didn't take off. Maybe they were eaten by a giant Xerox. A world where screens by default are vertical. And if you're wondering why it was like that when every other computer has a square, it's so that an A4 sheet of paper would be accurately represented with no wasted space. The Alto was meant to be an actual functional machine for offices. Had it only cost several tens of thousands of dollars less, it would have probably taken off. Now let's move on to 1974, the year when the Rubik's Cube was invented, the year when the MRI scanner was developed, when a small electronics component manufacturer called Foxconn was founded, which now has factories that span several cities, the year that the Altair 8800 was first sold, and would soon offer quite a unique opportunity for a few certain people to enter the computer business. It was the year that the late great Gary Kildall created the CP/M operating system and founded digital research. In the process, he also gave even more opportunities to those certain people to steal ideas and mooch off someone else's work and then be heralded as heroes and visionaries. If you don't remember what CP/M was, it would soon be the most popular operating system on the market for a few years. Also, MS-DOS was based off of a non-licensed clone of it. In non-technical news, PepsiCo became the first US company to sell its products in the USSR legally, spreading the threat of soft drinks to new places. And this was the year when ABBA became a worldwide sensation after winning Eurovision with Waterloo. This may or not be good news, depending on how tired you are of ABBA. But in gaming, the non-electronic kind, a great event did indeed occur. Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax published Dungeons & Dragons, the seminal game that turned tabletop RPGs from a niche hobby for enthusiasts to still a niche hobby, but for a broader and growing segment of the population. The same segment that was really into computers. In the world of video games, we got a new video game console, or at least the Italians did, in the form of the Pingotron, made by Zanussi, a company more famous for its line of washing machines and refrigerators. It was basically Pong, but you could also play it by yourself with a paddle and a wall. 1974 marked the entrance of Namco in the gaming market by buying the Japanese division of Atari and establishing its own presence that would only grow over the next few decades. Magnavox itself was bought out by Philips, meaning that the Odyssey would be around for a while. Remember Taito? Well, they had started making video games, quite a few, like a basketball game called Basketball that Midway brought to the market in the US. It was an early example of sprite-based graphics and probably the first Japanese game to be licensed in the US. Taito also released a racing game called Speed Race, an early example of the scrolling screen effect, giving a better sense of speed and movement than some of the other racing games at the time, such as Atari's own Grand Track 10 that featured a top-down approach and no opposition, just the player's own skill put to the test through a winding track with the occasional oil slick. Then through its acquisition of Key Games, Atari brought us a game called Tank, where two players would pilot their own war machines through a maze with the aim of blowing up each other. It can be seen as a precursor to many tank battle games, from Battle City to maybe even World of Tanks. An important thing to note is that by 1974, university networks had become a lot more complex, with mainframes capable of sustaining thousands of terminals, all with graphics capabilities running together in the Plato network, one established to spearhead education, allowing access for even more students to technology and of course, games. One such student was Jim Bowery at the University of Illinois. Inspired by Empire, the space game we discussed a few weeks ago, he set out to create a similar game with a different perspective, the first-person perspective. And so we got Space Sim, short for Space Simulator. Much like Empire, it was a multiplayer game capable of supporting 32 players split into 4 teams, each fighting for control over a few solar systems. It actually had 2 versions in 1974. The first was built up as more of a straight shooter with the help of other pioneers like John Daleski of Empire fame, and was without a doubt one of the works that pioneered the first-person shooter genre along with Maze War. The second version was a bit more complicated, developed by Bowery alongside a fellow student named Frank Canzolino, and it wasn't as reliant on combat. It focused more on cooperation, on trading, much like Dave Kaufman's Space Trader, that although was made in 1973, didn't truly see the light of day until its source code was published in 1974. Both of these games allowed for more versatility than just blowing stuff up, and that way, Space Sim and Space Trader became the foundation of what we know now as the Space Sim genre, and we'll have plenty more to talk about that in the coming weeks and months. The Plato network also housed M199H, what is considered to be probably the first computer role-playing dungeon game, where you would take the role of a hero going around and vandalizing someone's lair. The game was developed around this time, though I cannot be exactly certain when, because it was deleted. There isn't much known about its creator, and the game does not survive to this day, but what we do have are the games inspired by it. Games that would, next year, start a revolution. We're coming to the point where it's becoming difficult to cover each and every game that appears in a year. I haven't done that up until now anyway, because there are many unknowns and many that slipped through the cracks. But it's at this point that the number of games being developed increases exponentially. Whereas a couple of years ago we had 1, maybe we had 2, maybe 4, maybe 8. Now we're getting to 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. We're getting to the point where I'm going to have to focus on just a few. I'll try to name some of the more relevant ones that came out, but this series is not meant to document each and every one of them. That would be impossible for just one person in just 1 year, with 1 show a week, while doing shows every day of the week, with different topics, different subjects, and in some cases requiring more time to do than this actual show. So I will do my best to stick to the important ones. This also means that I may need to tone down the other stuff, because once we get into the gaming world as it is, the real world sort of doesn't seem as relevant anymore, though important events will still be highlighted in this show. And if it happens that I missed a game that you believe should have been mentioned in a certain year, please leave a comment, and I will do my best to give it a special mention in the following week's show, much like I did this time with the Xerox Alto, whose omission I couldn't really explain. It just slipped through the cracks. With that being said, the game of the year 1974 would have to be Space Sim. When you look at it, you can see the seeds of things like Elite, the basic elements that would bring us a lot of beloved space adventures in the years to come. Not that the racing games and driving games wouldn't eventually get to offer players experiences that can be just as enjoyable. After all, in 1974 we had the first video games that actually featured cars in a racing situation and not just ships. But with the snags that the actual space race was hitting in the real world, I put Space Sim here because it's always nice to be able to explore space, at least in the virtual world. Goodbye.